All right, so it's another episode of Twiss, This Week in Space Science. I'm Michael Baltimore, and I'm here and very happy to introduce Dr. Sean Cruzen, the director of the Coca-Cola Space Science Center here in Columbus, Georgia, at Columbus State University. Sean, welcome to Twiss.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here, as always.
Well, it's great to have you here. We've got so many things to talk about today. You know, our shows are going all over the web, and they're in lots of places now, so people can see Twiss on the Roku player, on the stream on the web, in apps, in various places. But more importantly, now for this first time in 2014, you can go and see these as podcast in iTunes. So we want to invite our viewers to go there and see these episodes. Some of those that you've missed, you want to catch up on. So, wow, we've got a great show for today.
Yeah, so I guess we're talking to a whole brand new audience then, right?
Well, we are out there. Somebody said there were 3 million iPhones and 170 million iPads out in the world. So that's at least 3 or 4 people may be watching.
That's fantastic. It's fantastic. Well, you know, so the beauty of this show is that, you know, we get to share some cool things about space science, astronomy, those kinds of things, and you know, my motivation for doing the show is just to share my enthusiasm about those subjects with as many people as possible, and just try to get people to understand what's actually going on out there in the world of astronomy and space science. And so I really appreciate the venue to be able to come into to the studio and do the show with you.
Well, we feel the same way, and one of the things is that I've noticed is there's some contagion, because there's a lot of us that get excited about space science simply because you brought that information to us. We had one of our crew members come in just a minute ago and said, "Are you going to talk about those twin planets?" And I thought, yes, everybody's excited about this kind of information. Now, today we're going to talk about commercial space. There is a lot going on there.
That's right. So a lot of times we'll take on topics from astronomy, but today we're going to be looking at more of the space flight and the commercial space flight angle of things, because there's just a lot of cool things that are going on, particularly in the world of commercial space flight. And there are companies that are making major milestones in the year 2014 to start the year off that are commercial space flight companies, and it's just an exciting thing to watch, and it's an exciting thing to kind of, it feels like we're watching history. It almost feels to me like we're watching a modern day space race that maybe people aren't quite as in tune with as they were during the Apollo era, but yet it's just as real as during that time.
Yeah, and it is exciting, and I think people need to pay attention to these things, because the Elon Musk of the world,
that's right.
Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, all of those guys are out there and moving forward very quickly, too. They're not sitting back waiting. They're moving very fast right now.
Yeah,
we should know more about what's going on. We really should. So I'm glad we're talking about that today, commercial space. Where do we begin?
Well, we begin with Virgin Galactic, because they have arguably one of the better stories to tell in this whole thing, although we're gonna go back to one of their contenders in just a moment.
All right.
But Virgin Galactic on January the 10th, 2014 had a very big milestone, and that's that they had their 3rd powered test flight of their Spaceship 2 spacecraft. But this time they went Mach 1.4. They went supersonic.
Wow. Okay.
Now this was the first time that it was flown in supersonic mode by the test pilot, by their chief test pilot, Dave Mackey. So that's all a big story. Now what you're seeing right now, this is 2 aircraft, believe it or not. So on the outer side you have Spaceship 2. I'm sorry, in the middle you have Spaceship 2. On the outside you have White Knight 2. So Spaceship 2 is the part that's in the middle that has the 2 fins that are going vertically and kind of looks like a spaceship. The rest of that big apparatus that looks like an airplane, that's White Knight 2. It's the 2 fuselages that are on the outside, plus that very long wingspan and the longer tail sections you see there.
It almost looks like it needs 2 pilots on that.
It almost does.
You know, the way that fuselage is so far apart over there.
Well, and in fact, 2 pilots were flying White Knight 2, and also a couple of pilots in Spaceship 2. So Spaceship 2 is designed that it flies up underneath White Knight 2, the bigger aircraft, takes it up to altitude, and then it drops out from underneath. And here we see a beautiful shot of the undercarriage of those 2 aircraft. But of course, I'm calling the middle one an aircraft. It's honestly a spacecraft, is what it really is.
Yes.
It's designed to go to outer space. Hasn't done that quite yet, but is getting ready to. And so what we're looking at right here is a camera mounted on one of the wingtips of those rear wings of Spaceship 2, and it's showing that powered flight that took place just last week. So this is a very important test for Virgin Galactic. It's moving them one step closer to being ready to take space tourists into a suborbital flight, up and then back down again, and experience a period of weightlessness while they're at the apex of that orbit. Now the last orbit, again, as we said, it went Mach 1.4, which that's really fast, by the way.
Sounds like it's really fast.
It's very fast.
So, yeah.
Their test pilot, Dave McKay, said it flew marvelously at that high speed. So the aircraft, or the spacecraft, I should say, it's being an aircraft at this point because it's not in space yet, but it performed fantastically, just all the way to spec. It flew at 71,000 feet. It has a very unique re-entry where it kind of feathers those outer tails to bring it back down. And that's going to be important when it goes to that very high space altitude of 63 miles. They're going to have to bring it back down and use these special feathering techniques. They tested those. That test went well as well. And so this spacecraft is getting ever closer to being ready to take those tourists who've already bought tickets.
Right, all the tickets are out there.
At somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, depending on when they bought it. $200,000, $250,000 per flight. Tickets sold, passengers waiting, just got to get through all the tests and they'll be ready to fly. And it looks like they're moving through those tests very successfully. So we could be seeing flights of space tourists on Spaceship Two this year, in 2014.
All right,
that's the timetable. So it's going to be an exciting thing to watch Virgin Galactic as they develop this craft, as they test it, and as they get it rated to be ready to take space tourists.
Now, coming back in, is it like the space shuttle? Is it gliding back down for a landing, and it can land on its own?
Yes, it does glide. It's not like a capsule where a parachute opens and it drops like a parachute. It does come down more like an airplane, and to bleed off the speed, the energy, as it were, from that high altitude, it does this feathering technique, and it also flies around in a lot of circles, and uses that to kill off its speed, comes in, and lands like an airplane. And again, a test of that system was just carried out in this last flight, looking good, and we're really excited about Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, the guys at Scale Composites that are building this spacecraft, and all the folks involved with Spaceship Two. And we're wishing you the best of luck and looking forward to seeing you take some tourists to space this year.
Wow, Richard Branson is on the cutting edge, and he's got a lot of courage. He doesn't hold back. He's going to move forward on a lot of these things, which is kind of amazing for us to sit back and watch, but it's happening this year. You know,
when you move into a new arena like this, it really takes somebody who's willing to be a pioneer and take the risks and put up the investment and hire the right people and be patient enough to go through all the engineering processes necessary. And I think of Shackleton trying to explore the Antarctica, and all the things that he went through to try to organize those great missions. And in a way, Richard Branson is like a modern-day Shackleton, where they're getting ready to explore this new field of space tourism from a commercial standpoint, by a commercial spaceflight company.
Well, it is just amazing. But, you're right. I mean, he has to move forward, and there's probably a lot of people who would say, no, you can't do that, or maybe you shouldn't do that, and put the brakes on a little bit. But these are the kind of guys that move out there. And I'm sure before this show is over, we're going to talk about Elon Musk. But maybe not next, but we're going to get there. All right, so what else is going on?
Orbital Sciences Corporation had a great flight of their Cygnus spacecraft. Now, the Cygnus spacecraft is about the size of a small bus, or like a little shuttle van, but it's a spacecraft that's capable of taking a lot of cargo into orbit, and it took cargo to the International Space Station for the second time. And here it is blasting off. This is actually one of their own rockets. So this is a rocket that's also developed by Orbital Sciences Corporation. It's called the Antares rocket. And so they launched their own spaceship with their own rocket, right? So they have, much like SpaceX, we mentioned just a minute ago, they have a delivery system, and they have a spacecraft that's under contract to take cargo back and forth to the International Space Station. Here you're getting a good look at that Antares rocket sitting on its side. At the front end is where the cowling is. That's where the payload is, and that Cygnus spacecraft is inside there. But you can get an idea of scale of just how big this thing is. It's pretty large, and that's the rocket that carried that payload into space. Now, the Cygnus spacecraft that just launched on January 12th, and it has successfully docked with the International Space Station. It delivered 2,780 pounds, 2,780 pounds of cargo. That's the most ever delivered to the International Space Station by a U.S. commercial space transport. So, so you might be aware that both SpaceX and Orbital Sciences, the Cygnus spacecraft, have gotten cargo to the ISS, but this is the biggest payload yet by one of these commercial space vendors. Orbital Sciences, they're contracted for 8 flights with NASA.
Okay.
40,000 pounds of cargo total at a contract price of $1.9 billion. So this is a this is a big venture for them, and it's great to see them have additional success. Now, that particular spacecraft, its design is strictly limited for cargo. It's not designed to ever be transitioned into a human-rated spacecraft. In other words, they only mean this thing to ever carry cargo. All right, it's bigger than the other vessel we're going to talk about from SpaceX in just a minute, but it's also not designed for human rating. It's designed specifically for cargo. So it's carrying out its function already to the end game.
All right. So talk just a second about the International Space Station. What's going on up there these days? We see a little bit in the news about it, but you know, we kind of take it for granted sometimes.
Right.
We don't see it. We don't hear that much news about it. It's just up there doing all these scientific experiments, we assume, but...
Well, there is an international crew that's still on board the International Space Station. Most recently, there were a couple of spacewalks that were done by 2 of the cosmonauts who are up on board of the ISS right now, and they just installed these big, beautiful, high-definition cameras to look back at the Earth. All right, so that's one of the things that they're doing up there. Those high-def cameras were actually designed by a Russian company, so it's kind of a commercial venture in itself, and they'll be selling that camera time to people who want to buy high-res imaging of the surface of the Earth. So if you have some kind of an environmental problem, or if there's a land area you want to look at, or if there's some kind of a natural disaster that they need to photograph from space with high resolution, those cameras are going to be available now to be able to undertake that task on a contract basis from this Russian company. So that's one of the things that's taking place. But it took a series of spacewalks to be able to do that. Actually, the cosmonauts went out and installed the cameras, and they couldn't get power to them. You run a TV station, it's probably similar to that. You probably have power cables running all over the floor that sometimes they disconnect, or sometimes you don't know what they're running to.
I think we've got cables in here that are not hooked up to anything a couple of times there. So yeah.
I'm not going to say it's the same on the International Space Station, but once in a while you do have a few technical issues. So they actually had to uninstall the cameras, bring them back inside, figure out what that power issue was. They solved it, took the cameras back out there, mounted them up, and were able to successfully get power going to those cameras. So that's what's happening at the International Space Station.
Thank you. I just threw that question at you, but I knew you would know what the latest was going on up there at ISS. All right, we've got another story. It's about, I love this title, Dream Chaser.
I like the Dream Chaser.
I like that idea. What's
it's a cool spacecraft for a couple of reasons. One, you can't beat the name. The Dream Chaser is just a cool name for a spaceship. The second reason I like this is because it looks like a little mini shuttle. This is a really neat looking spaceship.
Okay.
And it looks like a little tiny mini shuttle, and it's designed, again, as one of these commercial vessels to take passengers back and forth to outer space. However, with this particular vessel, they're contracting it to go back and forth to the International Space Station, is what they want to do.
Right.
But the European Space Agency is actually looking at being able to contract this vehicle to haul their astronauts back and forth.
I like the looks of this thing. It looks a little like a space shuttle.
It looks a little bit like a space shuttle.
On it
exactly.
Like it does, yeah.
You see the SNC, the letters SNC inscribed on the side. That stands for Sierra Nevada Corporation, and that is the company that's been designing this particular spacecraft. They have entered into some partnership agreements with some folks in Europe, primarily in Germany, but these are European Space Agency entities that they're looking to do exactly what that artist concept was just showing, take the Dream Chaser up and dock with the space station and carry these European astronauts back and forth, along with payloads, small payloads, back and forth to the International Space Station. So one of the things that Sierra Nevada Corporation gets out of this, they get an infusion of cash if these agreements go through, which helps them continue to fund their spacecraft. They also get a shared technology with the European Space Agency. So the European Space Agency folks will be sharing some of the technologies. Those technologies will be either installed or incorporated into the Dream Chaser itself. It's a push forward for Sierra Nevada Corporation to be able to come up with these agreements. Now, we don't know where that's leading yet, but they did just announce those agreements, and we're anticipating that will help them advance their little mini shuttle, the Dream Chaser.
Well, it looks like it's advanced too. By the way, use that term, but I just love that model we were looking at in the actual spaceship itself. It's kind of on the cutting edge a little bit. There.
It does look like a cutting edge craft. Obviously, it's designed to be aerodynamic, so it can come back in and land.
Is
very
that
much like
going
an
to
airplane.
launch similar to a space shuttle on a big rocket?
Well, yes, it can actually. It's small enough that it can actually launch in the payload area of a rocket, so it can launch on a vertical formatted rocket, vertical liftoff. And as it does that, then the cowlings will separate away. The spaceship will come out and be able to complete its space mission, and then come in and re-enter very much like the space shuttle did, like a space glider. It's not really a space plane because it's not a powered flight. It's coming in as a glider, and it comes back in and can land on a runway. So that's the concept anyway.
I like it. I like it. That's pretty exciting. But we can't have a show without talking about SpaceX and Elon Musk. And I know it's coming. You always have that on your agenda. So let's get to it right now. What's SpaceX up to?
It's very difficult to talk about the commercial spaceflight industry and not mention SpaceX.
Exactly.
And that's because they're just doing so many cool things. They're having so many successes. Success after success for SpaceX. And I think the last one we talked about on our show here was the fact that they were able to put a payload out to geostationary orbit, which is much, much further from the Earth than the International Space Station orbits, or some of these other satellite orbits that we talked about. So it's very, very far out there. It's 22,000 miles out there. Well, now SpaceX on January 6th successfully launched with their Falcon 9 rocket a satellite for the country of Thailand, for a company in Thailand called Thaicom. So this is Thaicom 6. It was launched on January 6th. It made it out to its orbit of about 55,000 miles, and its orbit will degrade from there and settle into a geostationary orbit of about 22,000 miles, a little bit more than that. But that's so it can be directly over a single point on the ground all the time. That's the concept behind that geostationary. The orbital period of the satellite is the same as the rotation period of the Earth, so it hangs above the same location on the Earth all the time. Now here's a concept art of that particular satellite. This is Thaicom 6, and it's a $160 million communication satellite. It has various communication bands. The advantage for the company that builds the satellite is that they can now sell their communication bands, their radio, their bandwidth, so to speak. And so that's how they recoup their money out of that. And so at a cost of $160 million, they're hoping to make that money back by selling telecommunications.
Wow, you know, these stationary satellites and that orbit the Earth, I imagine that, and maybe you've had this on the show, I have to look back at some old episodes, but the map of what's out in space around the globe seems to be tremendous. It looks like it's very busy up there.
Yeah, it
and
does
the
look
space
like that.
it's getting a little crowded in space, at least around the Earth in that orbit.
And it is, honestly. And so one of the things that is a concern is a lot of space debris. It turns out Japan right now is actually working on a magnetic satellite to go up there and magnetically attract some of the space junk and deorbit it, just get it out of the way. And they'll probably contract that service out if they can perfect that particular device, because they want to get rid of all that space junk so that actual payloads, or perhaps even human space payloads, are safe as they're in orbit. I need to point to the movie Gravity.
Right.
Which is clearly a fictionalization. However, it's a fictionalization of a real circumstance, which is space debris is very hazardous to spacecraft that might be in orbit around up there. By the way, up for 10 Academy Awards? I think I recently just heard that.
Maybe too many in my category, but yes, this is for quite a
This doesn't have anything to do with your Sandra Bullock prejudice, does it? I'm really sure.
I do have some issues, but yes, but look at that. I mean, if somebody can design something to go up and collect some of that metal, and to be a little bit safer up there, because it does represent a big hazard.
It does. It does. And there have been a couple of incidents where various governments have, for military purposes, tested their ability to blow up satellites in orbit, which leaves vast uncontrolled debris fields up there. There have been incidents where satellites have actually run into each other collided and torn themselves apart, also causing debris fields. So these are hazards to navigation, as it were, within the space orbit. Now, the one thing I will caution you is, if you've seen one of these images that Dr. Baltimore was just describing, where you see the Earth and you see a representation of all the points out there that represent payloads, remember that most of those images are not to scale. All right, so it looks like a giant swarm around a tiny planet, and it looks like, oh my goodness, the space neighborhood is already too full. How dare we launch anything else up there? Well, remember, the Earth is actually very, very large compared to these little tiny space payloads. So there's still a lot of room up there in space, in orbit, even in geostationary orbit. However, one of the serious concerns as humankind continues to populate its orbit, its low Earth orbits around the planet, and even its bigger orbits like geostationary, one of those concerns is just the amount of stuff that's up there, where it's at, being able to track it, make sure we don't blow it up and have it scattering randomly out there through those orbits and damaging all these other spacecraft that are in orbit around.
I would imagine, too, that you have to know that where that space is that you're sending that payload to, and making sure that that space is open and it's not next to another one. So how do they manage that?
Yeah, there are agencies of international space law, of which I am not an expert, by the way, but I do know that they exist, and there are there are contracts and agreements where these things are settled.
All right, that is very, very interesting. I'm glad. Well, a lot going on in commercial space.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost it's a daily thing.
It is a
you
daily
keep
thing,
up with all these
sure
news
is.
events. Well, there was a passing of a very important person,
Yeah.
and I know you wanted to mention that today. Tell us about John Dobson.
So John Dobson is a person who may be single-handedly responsible for a huge uptick in the hobby of amateur astronomy and just bringing astronomy to the masses. John Dobson was a guy who was a Buddhist monk in San Francisco, but just loved to look at the nighttime sky, and he really loved to share the nighttime sky with other people. And he built a telescope out of some junk parts. This is not it, by the way. This is, well, there it is. Okay, that's it. That's a telescope that's very much like the original one he built. So the original telescope that he built, the glass to make the mirror was a portal from a ship.
Okay.
And it was just a round window, right? And he managed to take that round glass, which he basically found in a scrapyard, grind it down to make the proper shape for a telescope mirror. He mounted it inside a giant tube, and he thought, well, now how can I most efficiently point this telescope at the sky? And he came up with a system that is basically a box that the telescope would sit on, two bearings, and it would allow the telescope to move up and down and side to side. A very ultra simple system for mounting a telescope. And so this telescope right here is what has now come to be called a Dobsonian telescope. And the Dobsonian was a design of John Dobson. Now, John Dobson, once he developed his telescope, used to take it rolling around the streets of San Francisco. And the streets of San Francisco, well, he would just find people out there and he would show them the moon or Jupiter or something. Even though it's maybe not the best place to observe because there's a lot of light pollution, obviously, he would find the brighter objects in the sky and be able to show them. People were amazed at this. And it started a whole movement in a club form called the San Francisco Sidewalk Astronomers, one of the earliest, most active amateur astronomy clubs in America. Amazing. And this is well, I would call it a grandchild of Dobson's telescope. Okay. This is a Dobsonian telescope that's significantly larger. I'm not sure how big this one is. It's about a 24-inch telescope is what I would imagine. But that's a Dob. We all in the trade, we call it a Dob.
Okay.
And when we say a Dob, we mean it's a Dobsonian telescope. But it's got that up and down, side to side, very simple two sets of bearings motion that allows for some very large telescopes to be put on some very simple mounts. And that's really his genius and his legacy for amateur astronomy, because now an amateur astronomer can build a telescope like that basically out of parts that they can construct in a garage somewhere. And you have all these amateurs building these fabulous large telescopes. Now, one of the neat things about that is that cradle design, thought up by Dobson, is now being used on some of the world's largest professional telescopes, because now they don't have to be mounted to where they have to track the rotation of the Earth by being aligned with the polar axis of the Earth. Because of computer control, you can actually come up with these two-axis adjustments in a rapid enough sequence with motors that you can actually build this ultra simple cradle design, but control it with computers and reproduce that same tracking motion that a polar aligned telescope would do. So some of the largest telescopes in the world now are just basically big Dobbs. They're big Dobsonian mounted telescopes, and it all goes in some way back to a credit to John Dobson, who came up with that crazy design and shared it with the world and helped inspire amateur astronomers like myself that have since gone professional and moved into the professional world of astronomy.
Well, I love the fact that he was so thrilled by this, he wanted to share it with others. Yeah. And then get them into it, and it just blossomed and grew from there. Yeah. That's amazing. I love people who have that kind of passion.
That's exactly right. Topic, you know? By the way, I think he was kicked out of the monastery, if I remember the story right, because he wasn't spending. He was doing too much astronomy and not enough of whatever they were doing in the monastery, so they booted him out, I believe.
All right. Well, a tribute to John Dobbs. I'm glad we got to talk about him. Yeah. All right. We've got one more thing before we wrap up today's show, and it has to do with something we've talked about on our tech show around here at CSU.TV, 3D printing.
3D printing is just exploding. It's exploding all over the place.
It's going everywhere.
It's a neat story, and we'll just cover it quickly. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has awarded a grant to the University of Southern California to further investigate the possibility of 3D printing a moon base. So sending robots to the moon without materials, mind you, to go up to the moon, gather the materials out of the lunar soil.
Oh, I like that idea.
And with the techniques developed by 3D printing, construct a moon base out of native materials. If this is perfected, this system is perfected, 90% of the materials needed to build the moon base are already on the moon.
Oh, right.
That makes this a very low-cost venture. In addition to that, you don't have to have a huge astronaut work crew to construct this particular facility. You just have these 3D printing robots do it, and right? So this is kind of an artist's conception of what that might look like, but it's a neat idea. And as you said, have moved into some 3D printing adventures here at CSU ourselves.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You brought in a wrench, a working wrench from your 3D printer.
Yes, we did.
We need to have that thing available at all times. We need that prop just every time a 3D printer is mentioned, because that thing is amazing that the moving parts are there. I still couldn't quite get over that notion, but 3D printers are big.
It is. And in a further spin-off, you may say, okay, well, printing a moon base is crazy. Well, they can print this thing in about 24 hours. So imagine if there's a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina, and you have to find a way to shelter a whole bunch of people very fast here on the Earth. You can send in a team of these very same construction robots, have them 3D print out very simple structures to just get people inside out of the elements in a very short time period. That's another possible spin-off technology for this. So it's a very interesting spin-off technology right here on good old planet Earth from the moon-based 3D printing that might someday take place on the lunar surface.
All right, let's invest in 3D printing, my friend. I think there's a future for that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for watching today. This has been This Week in Space Science. This is Dr. Sean Cruzen, Executive Director of the Coca-Cola Space Science Center here in Columbus, Georgia. I'm Michael Baltimore, your host for this show. We want you to tune in every week for Twiss. We'll see you next time.